Cairo, the year 1337. A respected Arab scholar named Shihab al-Umari arrives in the city to gather material for one of the most ambitious geographical encyclopedias of the medieval Islamic world. He expects officials to talk to him about tax records, trade routes, the ordinary business of empire. Instead, 12 years after the fact, he finds something stranger. An entire city still talking, almost obsessively, about one foreign visitor who passed through and never came back. Gold merchants still complain about him by name. Treasury officials still measure prices from before him and after him. Court clerks who were barely old enough to remember the event still repeat the same details, the same numbers, the same disbelief, as if it happened the year before. 12 years, and Cairo has not stopped talking. Try to imagine the last time a single visitor passing through your city left that kind of mark, an entire local economy still bearing the scars of one man's generosity over a decade later. The man they remembered was not a sultan of Egypt, not a caliph, not anyone from their own world at all. He was a king who had arrived from a kingdom most people in Cairo had barely heard of, stayed for only a few months, gave away staggering amounts of gold, and then disappeared south again, never to return. His name was Mansa Musa, ruler of the Mali Empire in West Africa, and in 1324 he passed through Cairo on his way to Mecca. Al-Umari did not record legend. He did not write down a story that had been softened and exaggerated by generations of retelling around a fire. He sat with men who had personally watched it happen, men who had handled the gold itself, who had stood in rooms with this foreign king, and he wrote down what they told him, in his own words, while the memory was still raw enough to argue over. That document survives to this day. It is one of the most detailed eyewitness records left behind by any traveler of the medieval world, and it is the foundation of everything you are about to hear. So what actually happened in Cairo in 1324? What did one man do that an entire city could not stop talking about more than a decade later? Stay with this story, because almost every claim in it traces back to a named witness, a dated document, or both, and by the end, you will have enough of the actual record in front of you to decide for yourself why so little of this story makes it into American classrooms. To understand why Cairo reacted the way it did, you have to understand what Mansa Musa was actually ruling over before he ever left home. By the early 1300s, the Mali Empire controlled a vast stretch of West Africa, territory that today touches modern Mali, Senegal, Guinea, and several neighboring countries. The empire had been founded roughly a century earlier by Sundiata Keita, a ruler whose own rise to power was already being told and retold as a foundational epic across the region by the time Mansa Musa inherited the throne. At the empire's heart sat cities like Timbuktu, Gao, and Walata, trading hubs where camel caravans arriving from North Africa met merchants carrying goods up from the forest regions further south. Arab geographers writing decades earlier, men like al-Bakri and al-Masudi, had already described a remarkable trading system along this route, sometimes called the silent trade, in which gold and salt were exchanged between Saharan merchants and southern gold producers who never directly met face to face, each side leaving goods and walking away until both sides were satisfied with the exchange. Whether or not every detail of that particular trading custom was accurate, the broader point these geographers were documenting was real. This region ran on gold, and it ran on a trade network sophisticated enough that Arab scholars writing in North Africa were already taking detailed notes about it generations before Mansa Musa was even born. What made Mali extraordinary, even among wealthy medieval states, was the sheer scale of its control over that gold supply. West Africa in this period produced an enormous share of the gold entering the medieval world economy, And modern historians estimate that for long stretches of the Middle Ages, the region supplied close to half of the Old World's gold. Mali's rulers taxed and controlled gold drawn from mining regions like Bambouk and Bouré, and that control over the gold supply was the real engine behind Mansa Musa's power, not just within his own borders, but across an entire trade network stretching thousands of miles, from the forests south of the Niger River all the way to the markets of North Africa and the Mediterranean. By the time Mansa Musa took the throne, around 1312, Mali was already one of the wealthiest and most powerful states most of the medieval world had never directly seen with its own eyes. That gold did not stay confined to West Africa or even to the Islamic world. Economic historians studying medieval European coinage have traced a significant share of the gold minted into Italian and other Mediterranean currencies of this period back to West African sources, meaning the trade network Mali sat at the center of was quietly underwriting parts of the European economy long before most Europeans could have placed Mali on a map. According to al-Umari, Mansa Musa himself told Egyptian officials a remarkable detail about exactly how he came to rule. His predecessor, a Mansa named Abu Bakri, had reportedly grown so curious about what lay across the ocean that he launched a fleet of ships out into the Atlantic to find out and never returned. Musa, left to govern in his absence, eventually took the throne himself. Historians today are careful about how much weight to put on that particular claim, since it survives only through al-Umari's second-hand account of what Musa said about his own family. But it is worth noting for what it reveals either way. This was a court confident enough in its own resources and curiosity to send ships into open ocean, whether or not that expedition succeeded. Mansa Musa did not invent Mali's wealth. He also did not rule alone in some isolated palace. The empire he governed had a working administrative structure, provincial governors, a standing military, and a system of taxation on trade goods passing through its territory, the kind of institutional machinery that allowed a state to function across such enormous distances long before Mansa Musa ever set foot outside it. What he did, on top of all of that, was decide to put the empire's wealth on display deliberately in front of the entire Islamic world by making the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, required of devout Muslims on a scale nobody traveling that route had ever attempted before. Why would a ruler already secure on his own throne choose to spend a fortune broadcasting his wealth to strangers a continent away? That question is worth sitting with, because the answer says as much about medieval religious prestige and diplomacy as it does about Mansa Musa himself. In 1324, Mansa Musa set out from Mali on a journey that would carry him across thousands of miles of desert through multiple kingdoms and into cities that had never seen anything like what he was about to bring with him. Later chroniclers, piecing together accounts from multiple sources, estimated the size of his traveling party at somewhere in the range of tens of thousands of people, with some figures running as high as 60,000, including soldiers, court officials, scholars, and a large number of enslaved attendants, a standard feature of royal travel across much of the medieval world at the time, from West Africa to Europe to the wider Islamic Middle East. Whatever the precise number, every surviving account agrees on one point: nobody had ever seen a pilgrimage caravan on this scale. And then there was the gold itself. Camel after camel was reportedly loaded with raw gold and gold dust, intended not just to fund the journey, but to be given away freely at nearly every stop along the route, as alms, as diplomatic gifts, as the kind of generosity expected of a Muslim ruler making this pilgrimage. Consider the logistics alone: feeding, watering, and protecting tens of thousands of people and their animals across the Sahara while negotiating passage through territories controlled by other rulers who had to be paid, impressed, or simply kept calm. The caravan would have passed through trading towns like Walata and skirted the great salt mines of Tagaza, where blocks of salt cut from the desert floor were so valuable in this trade economy that, according to several Arab geographers, they were sometimes weighed and traded against gold, almost ounce for ounce. Water was the real currency of survival out there, more urgent in the moment than any amount of gold. Wells had to be located, guarded, and rationed across a caravan of tens of thousands of people moving through some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth, where a single miscalculation about the route between water sources could threaten the entire expedition, regardless of how much wealth it carried. This was not a quiet religious trip. This was a moving demonstration of imperial power, visible to absolutely everyone it passed, and deliberately so. At several stops along the route, Mansa Musa is recorded as having sponsored the construction of mosques, leaving behind physical markers of his journey in cities he would likely never see again. The caravan moved north and east, crossing the harshest terrain of the Sahara before reaching the trade routes that funneled pilgrims toward Mecca. And at every stop, Mansa Musa distributed gold, building a reputation that traveled ahead of the caravan faster than the caravan itself could move. By the time he approached Egypt, word had almost certainly already begun spreading that something unprecedented was heading toward Cairo. Nothing the city had on record could have fully prepared it for what actually arrived. This is the part of the story al-Umari captured most vividly, because by the time he sat down with informants in Cairo in 1337, those people had had over a decade to reflect on what they had witnessed, and they still could not stop talking about it. Picture the scene they described to him: a procession entering one of the largest and wealthiest cities in the medieval world, trailing thousands of attendants, soldiers in formation, and pack animals so heavily loaded with gold that local residents reportedly lined the streets simply to watch it pass, the same way crowds today might gather for a parade they had heard about for weeks but never quite believed would actually arrive. According to al-Umari's account, when Mansa Musa entered Cairo, he gave away gold on a scale the city's own officials had never recorded before, distributing it to the poor, to religious leaders, to court officials, and to anyone in a position to receive his generosity. He reportedly purchased goods at whatever price was asked, without negotiating, again and again, as both a demonstration of wealth and an act of piety. He met with Egypt's ruler, the Mamluk Sultan al-Nasir Muhammad, and the meeting itself became part of the story Cairo would keep retelling, because Mansa Musa reportedly hesitated to perform the customary acts of deference expected from a foreign visitor approaching the Sultan's throne, only relenting out of respect for the religious significance of the pilgrimage, rather than any sense of political submission. Even at the height of a display that would reshape an entire city's economy, the man at the center of it all was, by these accounts, careful about how he positioned his own status relative to his hosts. The effect of his spending on Cairo's economy was not subtle, and this is the detail that kept the story alive in people's memories for over a decade. So much gold flooded into Cairo's markets in such a short window of time that the value of gold itself dropped. The very metal that anchored an entire regional economy suddenly became for once common rather than scarce. Multiple later sources, building on testimony like al-Umari's, describe gold prices in Cairo and the surrounding region staying depressed for years afterward, with some estimates suggesting the disruption lasted close to a decade. Picture being a gold trader in Cairo, a profession built entirely around the scarcity of one precious metal, and watching a single foreign visitor walk through your city and casually undercut the value of your entire livelihood simply by giving too much of it away. Would you ever forget that visitor's name? Al-Umari's record deserves to be treated as exactly what it is, a witness statement gathered from people who had personally interacted with Mansa Musa's court or watched the spending happen with their own eyes, written down by a careful scholar with every professional incentive to get the details right. This was not folklore passed down by word of mouth across generations. This was something closer to a modern journalist conducting eyewitness interviews more than a decade after a major event, and finding that the testimony had not softened or faded with time. It had hardened into local legend, repeated the same way by multiple independent sources inside the same city, which is precisely the kind of consistency historians look for when deciding whether an account reflects something that actually happened. What do you make of a ruler who could buy an entire city's attention and still chose restraint in matters of personal pride in front of its sultan? That tension between overwhelming material display and personal humility is one of the more human details tucked inside an otherwise larger-than-life record. From Cairo, the caravan continued on to Mecca, completing the Hajj itself, the religious obligation that had set this entire journey in motion to begin with. The pilgrimage placed Mansa Musa directly inside the same religious and intellectual networks as scholars, jurists, and rulers from across the Islamic world, men who would carry stories of the Mali emperor back to their own courts and academies in Baghdad, Damascus, Fez, and beyond. While in Mecca and Medina, he reportedly met and corresponded with scholars from across the Muslim world, conversations that, according to several accounts, planted the seeds for the wave of West African students and teachers who would travel to study in Mali in the years that followed, reversing what had often been a one-way flow of scholars from North Africa southward. For Mali, this mattered well beyond prestige. It cemented the empire's place inside a global Islamic intellectual and diplomatic community defined by shared scholarship, shared law, and shared trade relationships stretching from West Africa to the Arabian Peninsula. On the return journey, Mansa Musa is recorded as having brought back scholars, architects, and books, investments aimed squarely at the intellectual and religious life of his empire, rather than at further displays of wealth. One especially notable figure associated with this return journey is the architect al-Sahili, credited in several historical accounts with introducing new building techniques to West Africa, including contributions to the distinctive mud brick architectural style still associated with Mali's great mosques today, among them the Djinguereber Mosque in Timbuktu, parts of which are still standing and still in active use centuries later. Timbuktu, already an established trading center before Mansa Musa's reign, accelerated its transformation afterward into one of the most significant centers of Islamic scholarship anywhere in the medieval world, anchored by institutions like the Sankore Mosque and Madrasa, where scholars taught law, theology, astronomy, and mathematics to students who traveled from across West Africa and beyond to study there. The manuscript culture that grew out of this period left behind tens of thousands of handwritten texts, many of which survive today in libraries and private family collections across Timbuktu, and which scholars and preservationists have spent recent decades working to catalog, digitize, and protect from damage and conflict. Every one of those surviving manuscripts is, in its own way, another documented thread connecting the modern world directly back to the intellectual investment Mansa Musa made after his pilgrimage, and that thread very nearly snapped in living memory. In 2012, when armed conflict swept through northern Mali and threatened Timbuktu's libraries directly, a librarian named Abdelkader Haidara organized a quiet, large-scale effort to smuggle tens of thousands of these centuries-old manuscripts out of the city in trunks and boxes, transported by river and by road to safer storage in the capital, an operation carried out largely in secret to protect documents that traced their intellectual lineage back to the scholarly investment Mansa Musa made nearly 7 centuries earlier. That a modern rescue mission would risk so much to save paper and ink connected to this story should tell you something about how seriously the people closest to this history have always taken it, even when the rest of the world was not paying attention. This is worth sitting with for a moment. The same journey that briefly emptied gold reserves and disrupted prices in a foreign city also directly funded an investment in education, religious scholarship, and architecture back home, an investment whose physical and intellectual legacy outlasted the spectacle in Cairo by centuries. Which legacy do you think mattered more in the long run? The gold that briefly reshaped a foreign city's economy for a decade, or the scholars, mosques, and manuscripts that helped build one of Africa's most significant intellectual centers for hundreds of years afterward? That is a genuinely open question, and historians still debate how to weigh the two against each other. Mansa Musa's Hajj did not just live on in Cairo's collective memory and in al-Umari's careful documentation. It traveled, in writing, across multiple independent traditions, which is exactly the kind of cross-confirmation historians look for when separating documented history from rumor. The North African historian Ibn Khaldun, writing later in the 14th century, compiled accounts of Mali's rulers, including Mansa Musa, drawing on his own network of informants and folding the pilgrimage into the broader historical record of West African kingship that scholars across the Islamic world would reference for generations afterward. His account also described Mali as commanding a sizable cavalry and infantry force, a detail that, taken together with the gold, paints a picture of an empire respected for military and political strength, not just for spectacle. The traveler Ibn Battuta, who personally visited the Mali Empire decades later under Mansa Musa's successor, left behind one of the only true eyewitness accounts of the empire's internal customs, court life, and society, describing a level of order, learning, and Islamic legal observance that reportedly surprised even a man who had already traveled across most of the known world, from Morocco to China. Although Ibn Battuta arrived after Mansa Musa's own reign had ended, the stories he heard about the famous pilgrimage while he was actually inside Mali confirmed just how central that journey had become to the empire's own sense of its place in the world, still discussed at court as a defining moment a generation later. Perhaps the most striking piece of evidence, though, comes not from the Islamic world at all, but from medieval Europe. In 1375, a Majorcan cartographer named Cresques Abraham produced the Catalan Atlas, one of the most important maps of the late medieval period, created for the King of Aragon. Tucked into the section depicting West Africa is an illustration of a seated African king, crowned, holding a golden orb in one hand and a scepter in the other, with an inscription identifying him as the ruler of the gold-rich lands to the south, described as the wealthiest king of that entire region. That figure is widely understood by historians to represent Mansa Musa, more than 30 decades after his death, still recognized in European cartography as the defining symbol of African wealth and power, drawn not from imagination, but from a reputation that had clearly crossed the Mediterranean and embedded itself in European geographic knowledge. That reputation did not stay confined to maps and manuscripts either. Later in the 15th century, as Portuguese sailors, under the sponsorship of Prince Henry the Navigator, began pushing further down the West African coastline than any European ships had gone before, reports of Mali's gold and the wealth attributed to rulers like Mansa Musa were directly cited by later historians as part of what drove that exploration in the first place, a search for a direct sea route to the gold trade that everyone in the Mediterranean world had been hearing about for over a century. Think about what all of that means together. A king from West Africa, recorded by Arab scholars working in Cairo, referenced by North African historians, described secondhand by a widely traveled Muslim explorer, illustrated by a European mapmaker working for a Christian king, and cited as motivation for an entire era of European maritime exploration, all stemming from events that took place within roughly 50 years of his actual pilgrimage. That is not a single rumor drifting through one community. That is multiple independent documentation traditions, separated by language, religion, and geography, all converging on the same set of facts. How many other rulers from this period, from anywhere in the world, left behind that level of cross-referenced, independently verified documentation? Most medieval monarchs, even powerful ones, survive in history through a single court chronicler with every incentive to flatter them. Mansa Musa survives through outsiders, men with no particular reason to exaggerate a foreign king's wealth, other than the fact that what they had witnessed truly was that remarkable. And that brings us to the question this video is genuinely curious about, the one worth leaving in the comments below. If Mansa Musa's wealth and power were significant enough to be documented by Arab scholars, North African historians, a widely traveled Muslim explorer, and European cartographers, all within decades of his own lifetime, why does so little of this story make it into standard history education in the United States? Is it simply a matter of how history curricula get built, prioritizing certain regions and trade routes over others? Is it about which primary sources happen to get translated and taught first? Or is something else going on in how the story of medieval African empires gets told or quietly left out in American classrooms? There is no single right answer here, and that is exactly the point. This is a documented, well-sourced piece of medieval history, sitting in plain sight in the historical record for anyone who goes looking for it, confirmed independently by witnesses who had nothing to gain from exaggerating, and the real question is simply why more people do not already know it. Drop your own theory in the comments below, and if this is the first time you are hearing the full, sourced version of this story, you are not alone. And that fact alone might be the most telling detail in this entire video.